Okay, hello everybody. Welcome. This is Dr. Simeon Roger for the Leader Revolution, and this is another in our series of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Again, this is our weekly summary, and we're here really to answer the question, where are we heading? And also to look at the significant events in the last week or so. Joining me is Anthony Roger, a veteran defense and international affairs analyst. Welcome, Anthony.
Thank you.
And this is as the title is, it's a briefing for decision makers, and it really is intended to sharpen your appreciation of what's going on. So we hope to be able to contribute to that and cut through some of the nonsense that's out there. So today, we're going to do a quick summary of what's been happening on the ground. We don't want to spend a lot of time on that this week because, frankly, there hasn't been that much going on. So, what we do know is, of course, that the Russians have retreated from the north, and having failed to capture any of the cities in the northeast, whether it was Kiev, Chernihiv, Sumy, or Kharkiv, they have extracted their forces mainly into Belarusian and Russian territory and begun to move them down here to the southeast in preparation for a major offensive. So we know that that's coming. We know that there are already probing attacks going on in the east and southeast. We also know that the city of Mariupol down here has not yet fallen, to everyone's surprise, and that the Russians have essentially made no headway farther than Kherson, down here in the south, in a westerly direction. They have not managed to take or even seriously threaten Mykolaiv or Odessa as of yet. Now, with all that said, we're just going to keep going here. And today, what we want to talk about is, first of all, the sinking of the Moskva, which is probably the most significant event of this past week. Talk a little bit about the pressures mounting on Vladimir Putin and what those pressures are and how they might affect his decision-making. Decoding the Kremlin's language and ideology, the West has been really caught by surprise, in a sense, by this whole turn of events, and actually shouldn't have been. And then we'll try to answer as best we can where all this is going, as much as anyone knows. We don't pretend to have a crystal ball any more than anybody else does, but we'll take some educated guesses. Some of our educated guesses in the past few weeks have turned out to be pretty much on the money, but going forward, and who knows. So, when we look at the sinking of the missile cruiser Moskva, there are a few things that come to mind. Now, as we know, there are competing stories about what exactly happened to the Moskva. And the Moskva, of course, just a little bit of background. It is a Soviet airship. It was commissioned in 1982. Ironically, it was built, like all its two other sister ships, it was built in Mykolaiv in Ukraine. And it is fully loaded, about 12,500 tons. So it's actually on the very heavy side of a modern warship. It's a fairly typical Soviet design. And contrary to a lot of the garbage out there, it is not equipped to launch land attack cruise missiles against targets in Ukraine. It only has anti-ship missiles. So if anyone ever tells you, as a guest on the BBC did, that this vessel was capable of launching Kalibr cruise missiles against targets in Ukraine, no. Sorry. Now, as you probably have heard, the Russian version of this story, and here it is from the Novosti press agency, it simply says, translated, on the missile cruiser Moskva, as a result of fire, the ammunition detonated. Boom. Now, the funny thing is, on the basis of Russian history, performance, or the history of the Russian Navy and its predecessor, the Soviet Navy, believe it or not, this is not hard to believe. It is not hard to believe at all. Consider the following. Between 1960 and 2003, the Russians, the Soviets, and the Russians had no less than 20 serious accidents involving nuclear submarines alone, not talking about the rest of the Navy. This resulted in 294 deaths and the loss of 8 submarines. There have been more since then. There have been lots of ammunition depots exploding. Their lone aircraft carrier, the Kuznetsov, which is in for refit, the dry dock sank out from under it, and on it goes. So this is, not all that surprising.
Yeah, my initial reaction when I heard this particular deflection was, so it's more honorable to have blown your own ship up than to have the enemy do it for you. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, as you said, it's a believable excuse because they have this problem, and that may actually have been behind the sinking of that amphibious ship earlier. But
the Alligator-class landing ship in Berdyansk.
Yeah. Simply because nobody's been able to demonstrate that it was a missile, and the pattern of the fire looks more consistent with an ammunition fire. But for them, they still haven't the Russians still haven't explained what happened during that incident. So for them to come out now and say immediately the loss of the Moskva was the result of an ammunition fire, that says to me that no, it was probably something else.
Yeah, they seem to have realized very quickly they couldn't get away with denying the ship was damaged at first and then couldn't deny that it was lost entirely. Why, as you said, they thought it was more honorable to have blown it up themselves through carelessness than have the Ukrainians do it in honorable battle, as it were. Who knows? So it is rather bizarre. Nevertheless, what seems to give credence, at least from what I can see, to the Ukrainian story is two elements on the Russian side, where on the one hand, they very quickly moved much of the rest of their fleet to the south, farther away from the Ukrainian coast, and that they immediately launched a cruise missile strike against the factory in Kiev that manufactured the missile that the Ukrainians claim sank the Moskva.
Yeah, so the Russians are taking revenge for that which absolutely did not happen.
Yeah, that's pretty consistent. Yeah, that's pretty much Kremlin playbook, I guess. Now, if we look at the Ukrainian explanation, with the Moskva being towed away by a tractor, no, I'm kidding, but it's a good meme, since everything else seems to be. You see here the Neptune anti-ship missile. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the Neptune is essentially a Ukrainian take or modification on the old Soviet-era Switchblade missile. Switchblade being the NATO code name and Uran being the Russian name. And this is sort of Ukraine's crash program to develop some sort of coastal defense capability based on older technology, but perhaps updated. They received their first deliveries in 2021, so this is a relatively recent development, and because we haven't seen it in action yet in this conflict, it's probably a good bet that they don't have all that many of them.
Yeah, and it could be a good bet that they only recently got it operational or got it to the coast, since they have had opportunities to hit Russian ships with anti-ship missiles, but apparently haven't taken those.
Yes. And part of that may have been simply concealing the launchers so that they would not fall victim to Russia's air campaign.
Yeah, quite possible. So a missile like this, just so everybody understands, this is a rather small anti-ship missile. It's in the smaller category. It's very typical of, actually, it's very much equivalent to a lot of Western anti-ship missiles. Standard things like the American Harpoon, the French Exocet. It's in that class of being about, basically 5 meters long, so relatively small, about 150 kilogram warhead, range of not more than about, say, 190 to 200 nautical miles, or 300-ish kilometers. And it's a subsonic missile, like those typical Western missiles. Unlike a lot of Soviet era and Russian anti-ship missiles, that tended to be larger and faster, like the Vulkan missiles carried on the Moskva, for example, which were capable of Mach 2.5 or so. Whereas this is a subsonic missile, it comes in at roughly the speed of a passenger airliner going at full tilt. But if you have something coming in, crashing into your hull near the waterline, because it does have a sea-skimming trajectory, with a 150 kilogram warhead at Mach 0.85 or so, it's going to hurt.
Yeah. And the thing to realize is that the more typical, larger Soviet-era anti-ship missiles were things designed to do massive damage and perhaps even to sink their targets outright. And, of course, many of them also came with the option for a nuclear warhead. Neptune does none of that. It's basically, here is a pinprick that we hope will do sufficient damage, maybe to achieve a mission kill to send the ship back to base, or will start fires. Fire is the number one enemy of the modern warship. They are very, very flammable, and if their fire protection systems and firefighting training and equipment are not up to par, they sink very, very easily.
As the British found out in the Falklands, right, with the Sheffield being hit by an Exocet whose warhead actually didn't detonate. It's just it had leftover fuel that burned once it entered the hull of the ship.
Yeah, and once that happens in a modern warship, the electronics and the plastics encasing the electronics become the conduit for the fire.
So extremely dangerous. I mean, the other thing to consider is, if we have a look at, I guess we can do it now. Let's flip over here. So you see a diagram of the ship, right? Now this is Moskva's Pacific Fleet equivalent. This is the somewhere here. There's a anyway. So I've lost my cursor. Just a minute. Anyway, aha, there we are. That's why. So this is the Pacific Fleet's sister ship for the Moskva, the Varyag. The Varyag, incidentally, its Soviet-era name when it was commissioned was Chervona Ukraina, which in Ukrainian means red Ukraine. That wouldn't be popular today. Anyway, there was actually a fourth ship completed. There is one in the Northern Fleet, the Marshal Ustinov. There was a fourth hull completed. That one is sitting, rusting out in Mykolaiv, actually, in Ukraine. It was never refitted or made operational. But if we look at the design of the ship, what you quickly realize is no matter where a missile would impact, there's a lot of potential for hitting something that could start a chain reaction. So, look at the ship from bow to stern. The 130 millimeter cannon ammunition is going to be here. There is a magazine for the RBU 6000 anti-submarine mortars. Those rounds have a lot of explosive. That's going to be in the more or less the center of the ship in this area. Now, the actual cruise missiles are relatively invulnerable because they're in separate tubes. They'll be fairly well protected. But anything that hits aft of the main bridge structure, well, certainly here you're going to have main machinery, so that's going to affect the ship's ability to move at all. Here you'll have the magazine for the S-300 surface-to-air missiles, the long-range surface-to-air. And behind it, you'll have ammunition for the 533 millimeter, that is 21-inch torpedoes, plus right here the magazine for the SAN-4 Gecko system, known as Osata, the Russian short-range anti-air missile. So you have a lot in this, and of course, under the helicopter hangar, which is here, you're going to have some aviation fuel too. And the ship has to have its own fuel. So no matter where you hit, you do have some reasonable possibility of impacting something.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the very low quality infrared pictures that we've had so far of this incident have not been clear enough to show us exactly where the fire started. However, yeah, there are quite a few ways that this could have gotten out of control. And it's worth mentioning that Soviet firefighting practice was not up to Western standards, and these ships have not been substantially upgraded despite plans to do so. Apparently they ran out of money for that. So it's very possible that their firefighting equipment was not up to par. We don't know about their firefighting training, because of course you have to have a very, very well-trained crew to lock things down the moment a fire starts. And yeah, especially in any hit sort of aft of the funnel would have very quickly spiraled out of control. Aviation fuel is a very good way to kill a ship. Fuel oil for the ship is generically less flammable, but aviation fuel is very flammable. You have the S-300 VLS in particular. Those are not like Western cellular VLS. They're not divided up all into little boxes. They're sort of round magazines with all of the missiles just kind of hanging out together.
Yeah. Yeah, so it is a problem. And, as you say, that the Moskva was never really refit at all. It hadn't had a serious update since at least 2000. It had a very brief time in port in about 2009 to 10, but that's not enough time for an update. And what always struck me when I first saw this vessel, when it first went to sea, as far back as 1982, I very much remember my first reaction, which is, what? Why the older systems when you had newer ones available? So it was a question of, why this got the to use NATO code names, the Sandbox anti-ship missile instead of the Shipwreck anti-ship missile. Shipwreck was newer and placed on the Kirov-class battle cruisers and the Oscar-class submarines. So why the older system, the Sandbox, which had been seen as early as 1975 aboard the Kiev-class aircraft carriers? So the missile was updated. The original version was the P500 Basalt, and the newer version is the P1000 Vulcan. But it's essentially the same missile, the same system, and there was never apparently a thought to upgrade. In a similar vein, its short-range anti-air system, which you may remember is at the stern of the ship, is as I said, it's the system known as SAN-4 Gecko, to use Western parlance, or the OSA system, to use the Russian name. But when it went to sea on board the ship in the early 1980s, there was already a better, more modern short-range anti-air system, namely the Tor, the naval version of the Tor system. We've seen the Tor system on land during this land campaign, but it was also placed aboard ships beginning in the early 1980s. This was never it was never upgraded. Likewise, their terminal defense was really never upgraded. So it has the AK-630 30 millimeter Gatling cannons, but it was never upgraded to the later Kashtan combined missile gun air defense system. that we see on the upgraded versions of the Kirov-class battlecruiser Pyotr Veliki, for instance. So really, none of the systems were upgraded. The electronics, from what we can see externally, don't appear to have been upgraded. I would guess that there's a lot of analog systems still on that boat.
Very likely. We know that the Russians have developed more modern combat systems that can integrate their older electronics, but on the other hand, we've also seen photos of the actual combat systems that are still aboard these Soviet-era vessels, and it looks like, with very few exceptions, they have not been upgraded, at least not substantially.
Which leads to the whole problem of, if you had incoming Neptune missiles, how quickly would they be spotted, and how quickly could they be reacted to? Given, even though they're subsonic, you have really a reaction time that's measured in probably seconds, not minutes.
Yeah, and given the fact that really only the AK-630, the 30mm Gatling gun system, could possibly knock those missiles down. I mean, S-300 technically could do it, but they would have to see the missiles coming pretty far out. So if the AK-630 system was for any reason not on the ball, or the target, or was not slewed to the target, it would have been very easy for missiles to slip through.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much the case, and I'm guessing that it was just a case of not seeing them coming soon enough, not being able to react soon enough. And as you say, I'd have to put my money on the AK-630 in this scenario, and if it didn't perform, oops.
Yeah, but it's surprisingly common for systems like that to not have functioned because they were switched to the wrong mode, or something was going wrong in terms of the way the combat system was functioning.
Yeah, so that's a look at the sinking of the Moskva, which, as we said, was really the most significant event of the week. A huge symbolic defeat for the Russians to lose a ship of this size. This is, by the way, the largest warship sunk in combat since the Second World War. It is very slightly larger than the American-built Argentinian cruiser General Belgrano that the British sank during the Falklands War in 1982. Moskva is a whole 1 meter longer and a few tons heavier, but not much. So with that, we'll head on to our next topic, which is the pressures on Vladimir Putin are mounting. This is inevitable. And there are a lot of things going on here. One of the most obvious is the failure of the ground campaign. So the fact that Putin failed in the north, the Russians were actually defeated militarily in the north and the northeast by the Ukrainians, and were forced to withdraw in a rather chaotic manner because too many of their battalion tactical groups were dismembered or rendered ineffective, if not outright destroyed. In fact, out of 120 battalion tactical groups or so that the Russians committed to this from the beginning, the estimate of how many the Ukrainians rendered combat ineffective has gone up from 30 to about 37 to 38. That's a major, major loss of combat power. We've seen sheer military incompetence, the inability to carry out military operations in any competent way. Of course, the logistics problems are well known. The problem of secure communications is well known. The morale problem has been discussed endlessly. And the fact is, these troops are probably pretty much exhausted, yet some of them apparently are being sent straight to the Donbas.
Yeah, and in many cases, their troops are trying to either resign their commissions or, if they've reached the end of their contract, they're hoping to get out, or, some variation of that. They want to not be sent back into combat, and yet the state is telling them, no, you're going back no matter what. And that is not only incredibly demoralizing, but it speaks to the fact that the Russians had no plan for a prolonged campaign in Ukraine. They expected the Ukrainians to fold, and when that did not happen, they sort of carried on in what I would call zombie mode. They just kept going, hoping that the Ukrainians would break. And as of yet, we haven't seen a significant readjustment on the Russian part.
I'm glad you hit on the morale factor, or the desire of troops simply not to go back into combat, because we've apparently seen that with even VDV troops, the airborne troops, refusing to go back.
Which is astounding for such an elite force.
Yeah, if your elite troops are refusing to go back, what can you expect from your one-year conscripts who don't know anything and weren't told they were going to go into battle?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, May 9th, Victory Day, the commemoration of victory over Nazi Germany in the Second World War. On May 9th, there are always parades all over Russia, most notably in Red Square. And so there is this sort of thought going around that Putin really needs to generate results before that date, because it would be very embarrassing to come up to Victory Day and not have any victories to show for this campaign.
He could always ask a Ukrainian tractor driver to pull a tank through.
Yeah.
But you're right that there is the idea that Victory Day is in Putin's mind and very much on his mind, and I think it probably should be, just because I don't know how, even in a regime that can put endless spin on things, and I'm sure that the Taman Guards can trundle their very spiff, well-painted equipment through Red Square in Moscow, but with morale undoubtedly throughout the armed forces taking a big hit, I'm wondering if the military leadership and even Putin himself are worried about this.
Well, the military leadership at this point has to be internally quite desperate. And we've seen signs of this. We've seen them trying to sell their troops on the financial rewards that come with fighting in Ukraine, combat pay plus plunder. This is not the motivational strategy of a confident armed forces. And really, unless the Army Command can seriously turn things around, they're between a rock and a hard place. They don't have on their own what it takes to stand up to Putin on policy. This is not a regime that values transparency or speaking truth to power. And on the other hand, if they just keep going, eventually they know that they will be blamed by Putin for what is going on because he has to save face.
I think you can speak truth to power once.
Yes, in almost any regime, you can speak truth to power once.
Yeah, then it kind of goes sour on you. I mean, we've seen also symbolic defeats, the sinking of the Moskva being number one, the failure to take Kiev itself being an enormous defeat. I mean, the regime, of course, has tried to put a big spin on what its original objectives were and how objectives have been met. Even the suggestion that the entire attack on the Northeast was a feint. Okay, well, when a military feint costs you something on the order of conservatively 40,000 troops and hundreds of tanks, okay. Right, nice try.
Yeah, if your diversionary assault costs you that much, you're doing it wrong. And on the subject of symbolic defeats, yeah, Kiev was a major one. Kharkiv, the majority Russian-speaking city very close to the border that they still haven't taken, is another one. Mariupol will go down in history for managing to hold out this long. So no matter what they do, or whether they manage to take any of those cities, those symbolic defeats are always kind of around the necks of the Russian army.
Not to mention Chornobyivka,
Ah, yes.
just north of Kherson in the south, which the Russians apparently attacked 12 times, hoping to turn its airport into an airbase, and were defeated in exactly the same way 12 times. It seemed to have been a case of fulfilling Einstein's famous definition of insanity.
Yep.
Do the same thing again and expect a different result.
Yes, the economic pressures. So one of the things you will hear in the media is that the ruble has bounced back. They have somehow contained the damage, they have limited inflation, and the ruble is where it was before this all started. The real story is somewhat more complicated. What the regime is actually doing is trying to keep history from moving forward. In order to do this, they have prevented their citizens from exchanging rubles for foreign currency beyond a certain amount. They have forced them, in many cases, to convert their accounts in foreign currencies to rubles. They have raised interest rates sky high, which essentially means that no borrowing is going on in Russia. It makes it, in the short term, more attractive to hold rubles because they will earn interest, but that can only get you so far. On the stock market front, they have prevented foreigners from withdrawing their assets from Russian stocks. And they've taken a whole bunch of these types of measures that are designed to prevent people from reacting to sanctions in an economically rational way. The trouble with that is, okay, you can chug along for a couple of months like that, but in the end, you're dampening your own economic activity. And especially when you have the Russian state doing things like taking over leased civil aviation aircraft, defaulting on its debts, all of these things that continue to make the Russian state less and less trustworthy as a place to send your money. All of this has long-term implications for the Russian economy. Nobody is going to invest in Russia from abroad unless they are either bribed to do it by the Russians through the provision of very generous terms, or they're somehow being compelled to do it.
Yeah, one thing I saw recently was an interview with Bill Browder, the CEO of Hermitage Capital, who has had a long history of investing in Russia and knows Putin very well, and has known him for this essentially the whole time of Putin's term. And one of the things he said was that Putin and the oligarchs around him are roughly, as he said, the larger sort of oligarch circle of up to 1,000 people, have, in his estimation, stolen from the Russian people, from the Russian state, something on the order of about $1 trillion,
Hmm.
money that could have gone into healthcare, infrastructure, improving the economy. Heck, it could have fixed the military. But anyway, you know, this huge amount of theft, and when you have Putin's personal wealth estimated at something like 200 billion, it becomes very clear that the regime, as a kleptocracy, has essentially hollowed out its own economy for personal gain from the beginning.
Absolutely. And that money is not staying in Russia, it's going overseas. And for that reason, you have a Russia that, yes, has built up foreign currency reserves, but on the other hand, they're now in a position of having to use those foreign currency reserves to acquire basically anything and everything that they can still get from the outside to keep their economy going. And
including propping up the ruble.
Yeah, including propping up the ruble. And you cannot last very long that way, no matter how big your foreign currency reserves are. And in the meantime, all of this capital that could have been invested in the Russian economy is not in the Russian economy. It's, predominantly in the West.
And much of it frozen.
Much of it frozen, and much of the rest of it vulnerable. In order to do anything meaningful about this crisis, they would need to somehow bring that capital back, and they can't do that. They're not going to. The avenues are not there.
Yeah. They are getting a certain amount of meaningful revenue through their oil and gas sales that Western Europe cannot get off of easily. And that was, of course, part of the whole plan. But, if Western Europe is sending about $1 billion a day to Putin, and the war costs, well, I've seen estimates between 1 billion and 10 or 15 billion per day as for, the cost of the war. But he is getting some cash flow, but it's really not very much. And of course, none of it's going to the civilian economy, who is undoubtedly suffering a lot. I mean, we know even before COVID hit, real wages hadn't increased in a number of years. The economy was suffering from fossil fuel prices going down from the sanctions of 2014. Yes, Russians are generally passive in the face of government power, and they're used to hardship, but hardship is going to get a lot harder.
Yeah, and it may not amount to the overthrow of the regime in the near term, but it will definitely make it much more difficult for that regime to do anything meaningful in terms of domestic policy or in terms of rebuilding its military.
Yeah. And hurting that, of course, is this brain drain, where, as we know, roughly, give or take, about 300,000 Russians are estimated to have left the country since the beginning of this operation. And those 300,000 people are dominantly highly educated people. They're intellectuals, they're technical people, they're often young people, young to middle-aged people. And how do you recover from a brain drain that significant when your country is already in demographic freefall?
Yeah, it's a situation that reminds me very much of East Germany in the early years of the Cold War. Anybody who possibly could was moving across the border into West Germany, and this was one of the reasons for the Berlin Wall. They had to shut down this outflow of human capital. However, in this case, Putin's response has been, well, good, they were this westernized fifth column. The impure are leaving us. Unfortunately, he's going to find out that those impure were actually the people who were keeping his economy going.
And it's true, he may have bought himself some measure of lessened domestic discontent by allowing those people to leave. Yes, they were against the war. They are against the war. But on the other hand, even though the population that's left is likely to be more compliant, these people from the outside can still be a pressure on the regime in numerous ways.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to all that, we have, of course, casualties mounting. So by this time, it looks like the Russians have probably lost a minimum of about 50,000 troops killed, wounded, captured, and missing. Now, that's going to have repercussions on the home front. If you remember, as we said in the past, if you look back to the Afghanistan situation, which went on for 10 years, that had a total number of Russian killed of 15,000. Well, Putin's already at that. And the problem, or very close to it, and the problem is this has happened in a much shorter time frame. We know the regime is doing a number of relatively underhanded things to try to prevent this from becoming a domestic issue. But I don't see how it can avoid becoming a domestic issue, not only because casualties are rising and because families don't know where their sons, brothers, fathers are, or if they're still alive, but also because more true stories will come home with troops that are leaving that area.
Yeah, and that so far, I think, is the missing part of the equation. Yes, casualties are coming home, but what they need is what the Russian people need is to hear the real story of what's been going on in Ukraine from the people who experienced it firsthand. Because until then, all of these troops coming home in coffins, well, they were heroes. They were defending life, liberty, and the pursuit of borscht. I mean,
or the theft of TV sets.
Yes. And of course, the regime is trying to suppress the total numbers, and in aid to that, at least according to Ukrainian intelligence, is recruiting new troops and reservists predominantly from remote areas and from non-ethnically Russian areas. And this is a way to kind of dampen the impact of casualties upon the majority of the population.
And of course, casualties mean that the ground forces are being decimated in manpower, materiel, and reputation. And when we look at that, we're looking at Russian ground forces that appear to have already lost about 500 main battle tanks, 13 to 1,500 infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers, probably 2,000 other vehicles, including most of their transports or a lot of their transport. So their ground combat power has been substantially weakened. And the reputation, of course, is even worse because now the entire world knows that the Russian military suffers from systemic corruption, from widespread incompetence, and from unreliable weapon systems. So Russia's ability to threaten other countries in its neighborhood has been substantially degraded or brought into question.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons, incidentally, why the whole narrative of Russia's infinite manpower is so pernicious, because it allows Russia to issue threats to places like the Baltic states without anyone catching on that, hang on, they don't actually have the resources, they don't have the actual military formations to accomplish anything meaningful there while they're tied up in Ukraine.
No, I mean, as we said, I think, weeks ago, that Russia is not the Soviet Union.
No.
It lost half its population with the fall of the Soviet Union. And the idea that it has infinite manpower, it can throw at everything, well, that's something from yesteryear.
Yeah, absolutely. the system of reserves which the Soviet army relied upon, well, yeah, Russia has reserves, but it doesn't have the ability to bring masses of reservists who have kept up their training into units that are ready for them and give them equipment that's ready for their use and all of that, so that there's no way to translate the people who have previously been conscripted into a new massive manpower resource that they can use.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Soviet system of having, as they said, divisions that were Category 1, Category 2, or Category 3. Category 1 being battle ready right this minute. And Category 2, we can get them battle ready pretty quickly. And Category 3, okay, that's going to take some time. Well, the Russians, the entire rest of the Russian ground forces should probably be, become Category 4, which is we'll be ready for the war after the next one.
Yeah, it's the difference between having reservists who occasionally get refresher training and having a corps of officers and NCOs ready for them and having vehicles that have been well maintained ready for them, and just kind of having those vehicles in a warehouse somewhere forgotten, not well maintained, having no officers or NCOs ready for them, and having no refresher training for them.
Yeah, exactly. And that leads us to Finland and Sweden likely to join NATO. So, of course, this has been widely discussed, so we're not going to go into much detail here, but certainly Russia's ability to threaten Finland and Sweden into not joining NATO is apparently backfiring, which is no surprise. The regime, this is an interesting thing about the Putin regime, isn't it? That they seem to feel that the way that they will influence other regimes or other populations is by issuing threats, without realizing this seems to have the opposite effect in almost every case.
Yeah, I think they've fixated too much on the idea that Western countries are weak-kneed and weak-willed and will fold under pressure and will appease and placate. But on the other hand, this is also their modus operandi with the countries that they traditionally consider to be their quote-unquote buffer states. Places like Ukraine or even the Slavic countries of Central Europe. The more they threaten and abuse and invade them, the more they assume that these countries will love them.
Which explains why the Russians are so well loved across Eastern Europe.
Exactly. I mean, this is the thing to remember whenever Russia complains about Western influence encroaching on its borders. Countries align with the European Union and NATO because those alliances provide safety, they provide sovereignty, they provide every incentive for other countries to join them. Countries want to be part of this prosperous and peaceful sphere. No country, at least in Europe, wants to be part of Russia or even its close ally.
Well, that's the thing. If you can't contribute anything meaningful to the human condition and you expect to influence people in a positive way, you have something else coming.
Yeah, you're reduced to installing and or supporting dictators who will carry out your will. People like Lukashenko.
Right, who doesn't even like Putin, but has no choice if he wants to stay in power or perhaps even stay alive.
Mm-hmm.
And, issuing of threats leads us to really into decoding the Kremlin's language, the Orwellian language of the Kremlin. And there's George Orwell. Political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity and pure to pure wind. So the Kremlin is fond of talking about and using terms like aggression. Well, aggression, we always have to, look at these through this 1984 kind of lens. I remember as a kid reading up on when I was first reading about things geopolitical when I was rather young. And I did find an article that was really good about this. And it actually looked at how words are used by oppressive regimes and pointed out that they're used in kind of a weird opposite sense that doesn't relate to reality. So aggression, you're an aggressor if you're defending yourself against us. That's what an aggressor is. Mm-hmm. How dare you? Or you pursue destabilizing actions. And of course, as the Russians claim, the US and NATO are using destabilizing actions by sending weapons and material aid of any kind to Ukraine. Destabilizing meaning you're getting in our way. Or sovereignty is my favorite, I think, because if you look at that sort of Russian-Chinese axis, where, and we've talked about Russia's so-called alliance with China and how fragile that is, so we won't go into that right now. But when you look at those countries, what they're always saying is that sovereignty is absolute, national sovereignty is absolute. And that's a code word for you are not allowed to criticize any of our human rights abuses. But sovereignty only applies to countries we think it should apply to. So it doesn't apply to Ukraine, which is not a real country. Therefore, it can't have sovereignty.
Mm-hmm. And in the case of China, it doesn't apply to Taiwan.
Oh, heavens no. Absolutely not. Legitimate security interests, which it seems to be a code word for we want to take over about 15 different nations around us so we can feel secure.
Yeah, the idea of sovereignty in this case doesn't quite face up to the fact that if you're respecting the sovereignty of other states, you cannot treat them as a buffer zone. You cannot treat them as auxiliary to your own national policy. This is one of the most noticeable hypocrisies of the language used by both China and Russia. They want certain other countries to be their buffer zones, their tributary states, whatever they want to call it.
Then there's imperialism, of course. Imperialism is the old whipping boy of the communist regime, but seemingly no less for Putin's Russia, even if it's been stripped of any sort of particularly left-wing ideology. Imperialism or imperialists are people, again, who are getting in our way. Mm-hmm. How dare you build up the Western alliance? Clearly, that is imperialism because it's getting in our way. Much like Nazis. Nazis are people who get in our way. So if you get in our way, you were actually a Nazi and a fascist.
Yeah, it has absolutely nothing to do with ideology or the nature of a given regime. Because, of course, if it did, if you look at sort of the basic elements of fascism, Putin's regime checks most of those boxes. It doesn't tend to go in for the racial garbage, but other than that, it is in many ways a less overt, more well-disguised form of fascist regime.
Well, it's true. It doesn't go into something exactly like Nazi racial theory or anything like that. But on the other hand, if we look at what's behind the Kremlin, and here we have Alexander Dugin, who is often referred to as Putin's brain. And up there you see his book cover in Russian. Its translation is Foundations of Geopolitics, the Geopolitical Future of Russia. And Dugin has been a huge influence on Putin. He's a radical right-wing thinker. He is... To say that there is no sort of racial impetus there's certainly not only a Slavic chauvinism, but certainly a great Russian chauvinism.
Oh, absolutely.
where according to which yes, Ukraine is not a nation. Ukraine is just Malorus. It is just little Russia, and those are little Russians, and they should be happy to be Russians. And they're sort of like us. They're just Russian wannabes, I guess. So there is a certain amount of ethnic chauvinism going on there. And, if we look at what he actually talks about, he talks about the need, and this is, up to 20 years ago, he was talking about this, the need to take back Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states to restore Russian security, and more than that, to restore Russian greatness. So it's a vision of empire. So take back the principal buffer states in the West and the Northwest. It is basically Finlandize the rest of Europe. In other words, turn them into compliant states. And believe it or not, and it seems almost laughable, but he talks about really creating an empire from Dublin, Ireland, clear through to Vladivostok. So it is an interesting vision, which also, by the way, destroy China too. So hopefully Beijing has read this book and laughed. But this is quite seriously what is intended. And that Kremlin blueprint wraps very nicely into the other part of the equation, or the equivalent part, often referred to as the Russian world, Ruski Mir, or the new Russian world. And you can see sort of a map there with it. It's gone way beyond Dublin, Ireland in that map. They actually took Iceland and Greenland because there's not enough snow in Siberia.
Yeah, and this leads into the Kremlin's other favorite book, a piece of speculative fiction called The Third Empire by Mikhail Yuriev.
And the subtitle is Russia as She Should Be.
Yeah. This is sort of a future alternate history in which Russia has subdued all of its enemies. And the first step in all of that was, in this alternate history, remember this was written, 2008? The first step was a massive popular uprising in eastern Ukraine, which led to the annexation of eastern Ukraine. And during this process, Russia was able to secure the passivity of Western Europe precisely through its dependence on oil and gas. And so you have this vision of a future Russian Empire based on the assumption that the West will be passive and useless, and that the eastern half of Ukraine will easily be persuaded to return to the Russian fold. Now, clearly this vision didn't happen. However, you can see echoes of it in the annexation of Crimea and in the attempt by Russia to create a credible insurgency in the Donbas. If this book's sort of basic assumptions about Ukraine, that it was essentially a weak, insubstantial state just waiting to be knocked over, if those assumptions were correct, you can see where the ideas behind this current invasion came from.
Yeah, and there are a number of strands that go into this. This is clearly a stance against so-called Western individualism. After all, you can't have an authoritarian state if everyone's going to do their own thing.
Of course not. It would be inconvenient.
It's definitely a stance against the idea of rule of law. This is rule of sheer power. This has nothing to do with the post-war world order, which was set up to give sovereignty and self-determination to people and create a prosperous modern world, which it did very successfully for the last 70 years. National sovereignty, of course, except for ours. So-called liberal values, which we could go into extensively, but liberal values meaning anything from free speech to gay rights. Really, it goes that far. It's now sort of the anti-LGBT element has taken a lot of airtime in Russia. That's for sure, but there's much more to it. It really is wanting to repeal the post-war world order, which is ironic since Russia benefits from the post-war world order, as does everybody else. We talked about this, I think, last week, where revisionist powers want to change the post-war world order into something which they actually control.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the whole idea of that post-war world order is isn't like that. But there's the ingredients that go into this whole new Russian world thing. It's kind of interesting. There's certainly there's a certain amount of pan-Slavic nationalism, Russian chauvinism, nostalgia for imperial Russia, and the so-called Third Rome idea, which probably is echoed in Yuriev's title. The whole idea from Russian Orthodoxy that the Moscow Patriarchate is really the Third Rome in being the ultimate center of Christendom. The old Rome fell into heresy. The second Rome, Constantinople, fell to the Muslim Turks. And only Moscow was left.
Yeah, there are a lot of sort of deeply planted historical ideas mixed up in this whole nationalist soup. Certainly the idea of threats to national security coming from the West, which justify having a strong leader with strong security services to hold everything together. That was an idea actually planted by Tsar Ivan the Terrible. So this has a long, long, long history. The idea that all of the Slavs should look toward Moscow as sort of their metropolis, their guiding light. This has also been around for a while with a number of interesting consequences, particularly in the Balkans. It's an ideology that really, I think, comes from the self-justification of the Muscovite state. Because, remember, Russia is not from time immemorial. Moscow was one princely state among many. And the fact that it managed to subsume most of the others and was in contest with Western powers for the Western portions of, sort of Eastern Slavic-speaking territories. That is sort of the historical paradigm that's being justified with this kind of rhetoric.
Yeah, and sometimes perhaps we should do a video where we talk about the origins of this extreme security paranoia.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent it's real, to what extent it's manufactured, and talk about the incredible psychological dysfunction of the Soviet Union itself, which was really something amazing. Something that made the Soviet Union far different from Nazi Germany, even though in a sort of external sense they were both brutal totalitarian powers, yet they were quite different. But that's for another time. Right now we're going to get on to our final topic, which is really how does the war end? Where do we go from here? And there are a number of scenarios here. One of them would be Putin partially succeeds in Donbas, declares victory, and does what? Goes home, or simply settles in for a long drawn out war of attrition? Hard to say. But if the Russian army succeeds in taking the rest of Donetsk and Luhansk, remembering, of course, that at the beginning of this campaign, they really only had about a third of all that territory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that scenario, I don't know, we'll see, but it seems increasingly unlikely. If Putin were to come away with, well, essentially everything that you see in pink on that map, plus maybe a little bit more to fill out the Donetsk and Luhansk areas, that might give him a way out of the war. But then again, would it be a way out, or would it, in his mind, simply be a pause to rebuild his forces and try again?
Yeah, it's hard to say. It really is, and of course, this particular scenario has a lot to do with that May 9th deadline in the minds of many people, and perhaps Putin himself. Can he pull together something that looks like a victory by Victory Day? Well, we'll see. And the second one is Putin fails in the Donbass and his ground forces near collapse. In other words, it fizzles.
Yeah. This is kind of unknown territory. Historically, Russians do not react well to being on the back foot, and especially to anything that can be considered a comprehensive defeat. And that may not lead, for example, to the immediate overthrow of the regime, or even necessarily, I would say, to a durable peace arrangement. But Putin would know that it would not augur well for the long-term survival of his regime. Remember when Russia lost the Russo-Japanese War, that was in many ways the beginning of the end for the Tsarist regime. That made the regime look weak. It opened the way for various successive revolutionary movements, and failure on the Eastern Front of World War I was just kind of the final nail in the coffin.
Well, since we know that the coming offensive in the Donbass is likely to be much more a war of maneuver warfare, since it's more open country, it's amenable to tanks and large armored formations much more so than the North was. The problem with that is we know that the Russian army was incapable of executing even basic infantry tactics. So on what grounds would we believe that they're likely to be any more competent at maneuver warfare?
Yeah, and there are also a number of caveats. I mean, people have pointed to this terrain as being more open, more amenable to the use of tanks, which is true. But on the other hand, a state of absolute advantage for Russian tanks versus Ukrainian anti-tank missiles would be a totally flat open space. Think the Saudi desert or the Canadian prairies. This is neither of those things. There is plenty of terrain that the Ukrainians can actually use to stage anti-tank teams from. Everything from berms of industrial slag to tree lines to the occasional forest, towns, crossroads. There is enough stuff there to be getting on with. And certainly so far, the Russians in their ongoing offensives have made almost no ground in the past week.
And, with maneuver warfare, one of the things that was, quite evident from the beginning is Ukrainians were not deploying their own tank forces in mass formations or anything, not giving the Russians an opportunity for a major armor clash in any way, which was probably smart, just based on the assumption that even though the two use broadly the same types of main battle tanks, the Russian ones have had better upgrades. But in this case, since we've seen how completely incompetent the Russian army is, the Ukrainians may be much more willing to commit armored forces and may have a lot more success than they thought in tank-on-tank engagements.
It's entirely possible. And of course, the whole idea of tanks being able to maneuver on the battlefield depends on one other factor, and that is, has the ground dried up yet? Because springs in that part of the world, as in the part of the world where we are very muddy. Tanks do not do well in muddy conditions. They tend to get stuck, and this has happened to the Russians frequently throughout this campaign. So, for tanks to maneuver, they need to be able to maneuver off-road. Until that becomes possible, we may not actually see that many large-scale tank-on-tank clashes, simply because tanks will be confined to roadways which are by nature choke points.
Yeah, and which are kind of, few far between, well-known, easy targets, as we saw even in the north, let alone here. So, well, we'll see. Then there's always the possibility, and this has been discussed in the past week ad nauseum, that Putin could do something rash called escalating to de-escalate. And he has, of course, threatened the United States directly with a diplomatic note, saying that if they continue to supply Ukraine, this will lead to unpredictable consequences. And he has threatened the use of tactical nuclear weapons or had his propaganda machine do it for him on television and things like that. And this is, to me, I don't know what you think. It kind of is what we've talked about, what I've talked about before, or characterized before as kind of a Putin wildcard, saying, I'm mad, I'm mad, you never know what I could do. It is a sign of desperation. But there are other people, there are people who know the Kremlin who are saying, sadly, we can't discount this possibility.
Yeah, and the reason they're saying that is because there's actually less control over the use of things like nuclear weapons under Putin's regime than there was in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, it was in the final analysis up to the Politburo. Now, and that was a number of people with different points of view and different interests.
And most of whom remembered the horror of the Great Patriotic War and weren't keen to repeat it.
Absolutely. Under Putin's regime, it seems to be just Putin who is in control of that capability. And that is, of course, not a comfortable thing. The whole escalate to de-escalate thing is interesting. This is also something that you would find in Yuryev's book, where Russia is willing to rain nuclear fire on the Western forces, and they are not willing to retaliate, and Russia wins the contest of wills by escalating first and farther than anyone else is willing to do.
So basically, being better at poker.
Well, and being willing to prove that you're not bluffing, even if it means the lives of millions of your citizens. But on the other hand, rationally speaking, if Russia doesn't understand by now that the West is going to defend itself if attacked directly, they are truly living in a fantasy world. So perhaps the more credible worry is still that they might attempt to use weapons of mass destruction of one sort or another in Ukraine, which is not protected by NATO's nuclear shield. And that is it's a possibility that will not end Ukrainian resistance. It will massively stiffen that resistance, but and it may very well blow back on Russia in one way or another, perhaps literally given prevailing winds. But it is one of Putin's options if he wants to attempt to force a favorable settlement, and he sees no other options.
Of course, he hasn't really seemed any too sincere about finding a way out to this point. All peace negotiations have been basically stalls and endless, ridiculous demands. So, and then, of course, there is possibility, let's hope, that Putin's regime collapses and his successor ends the conflict. But, and this is where the but comes in, but who is his successor? Is it just that Putin is removed and someone of similar ideology but a little bit more sanity prevails? In which case the problem goes on, the underlying problem. Or is it a complete dissolution of the regime and its replacement by something near to normal, like Navalny or somebody like that? So, but again, that's pure speculation. The whole idea is, obviously we can't predict how close Putin is to potential regime change within Russia. So that's kind of, just putting it out there.
Yeah, Putin has a very good sense of what the potential dangers are here. And he has installed mechanisms to make it very, very difficult for a conspiracy to come together that's capable of overthrowing him. And he's made sure that the kind of access that you would need to accomplish such a conspiracy requires the collaboration of multiple branches, not only from intelligence, but from Rosgvardia, from his own kind of inner circle. You would need a lot of coordination, and that would suggest that in order to succeed, a conspiracy would need to be very motivated and perhaps led by somebody already within his inner circle.
Yeah. So that's really it for us for right now. So this is Dr. Simeon Roger from the Leader Revolution with Anthony Roger here with me. And we hope you've enjoyed that episode. Please remember to like and subscribe. And again, support Ukraine and Ukrainian relief efforts any way you can. Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you next time.